Bradley, that was Toccata and Fugue in D minor by J.S. Bach, right?
That's right.
I have normally heard that piece associated with Halloween. Is that the case? Did Bach write it for Halloween?
So most people do associate it with Halloween. A lot of people say, can you play that tune from Phantom of the Opera? But it actually had no connections to Halloween. It is the Toccata from Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Toccata is a word meaning to touch. It means playing lots of notes very rapidly. Toccatas are usually fairly free and improvisatory, and the story goes that this is the kind of piece that Bach might have improvised when he would go to try out a newly constructed organ. He wanted to find out how the keys felt. Were they heavy? Were they light? Was the action responsive? Did the pipe speak rapidly enough when he played quickly? How was the winding system? Did it have enough air pressure to sustain as he built up chords from the bottom up, adding more and more notes, bringing more and more pipes into play? We don't know if that story is actually based. In fact, it's kind of like a preacher's story. You know, it sounds good and makes a good point, but we don't even know if it's true.
Yeah, that's right. But it makes a great point. So it's a piece then that has been interpreted lots of different ways. In fact, one of the times it became even more famous was that it was included in the Disney Fantasia movie.
That's right.
So it was orchestrated then. The organ piece was written for an orchestra. Did that influence your interpretation of how you just played that for us?
In a word, yes. Yes. You know, the word interpretation is so wonderful because what it says is the composer gives us a blueprint. The composer gives us the notes, the rhythm, certain expression, and then it's the role of the performer to take that and breathe life into it, respecting what the composer offers, but going for the spirit of the law and not necessarily the letter of the law in every case. So that brings up lots of questions for the organists. What kind of pacing, how fast or slow to play certain parts, what kind of sounds to use, which stops should I pull, and that we call registration. All those sorts of things go into my interpretation of this piece. And I have to say, it's influenced by a lot of different things. I love Leopold Stokowski's transcription of that for the Philadelphia Orchestra that he then recorded for the movie Fantasia. There are all sorts of dramatic crescendo effects that he does on certain notes that would not have necessarily been done on an instrument Bach knew in his day.
So could you show us a little bit of that? Could you show us how you use the organ to create some of those orchestration effects?
Certainly. So I could just pull on a group of stops, a plenum, a kind of full Baroque sound, and play. And that's a kind of iconic sound that Bach would have known.
And probably the kind of sound that lots of organ professors would teach.
Exactly. And that's always a great starting point, to listen with ears that hear what the composer knew and had in mind. Of course, I love the Leopold Stokowski orchestration of that. And so what I like is to play that opening mordent, those first three notes, and then have a crescendo, which is a decidedly non-organic way of doing it. It's more orchestral, but I think it's quite exciting.
Yeah, show us how you make that happen.
So yes, I draw on a certain number of unenclosed stops where I can't control the volume, but I have a lot of stops that are enclosed in the swell boxes. I start with the swell boxes closed. And during that long sustained note, I can open these swell boxes that open the Venetian blinds, the swell shutters, letting that sound out and thereby creating that crescendo, which gives to me, on a note that would otherwise be static, it gives it energy and forward motion.
As any good orchestral conductor would expect of their players.
Right, exactly.
So you made some choices like that in terms of the sounds you chose. You also made some choices rhythmically that were not perfectly square. Tell me about those choices you made.
So given that a toccata is kind of it's the prelude to the fugue. The fugue is quite more strict compositionally, more steady tempo, steady rhythm throughout. The toccata is much more free. It's meant to be a contrast to that. And in a lot of ways, if you think about rhetoric and the way someone would give a speech, the opening is supposed to grab people's attention. And then later on, you start giving all the reasons and making the points and backing those up with evidence. But the toccata is really meant to say, listen to this. I have something important to say.
So can you give us an example of how you did not just pick one steady tempo and stayed there?
So in the toccata, there is that kind of freedom that one can employ. And one of the places of that is, if you played exactly what was written, it would just be.
And tell us about how you played it.
And so I like to start slowly and let it gather momentum. And pulling back a little bit at the end. So it gives a kind of shape. And in my feeling, that also breathes some life into it. It's natural with the flow, just like a person giving a speech would maybe start at one certain tempo and then increase the energy so that the listener is engaged throughout.
And thus the interpretation of a piece of Bach that can sound completely different in 100 people's different hands. It could sound 100 different ways with those kinds of choices.
And that to me is one of the most exciting things about music, and for me as an organist, is that it ultimately is all about communication. I take the music and then I try to figure out, how do I communicate to bring this alive, to connect with, to engage the listener? So I'm always thinking of how best to do that. Just as a person giving a speech is going to consider his or her audience, and knowing how best to make the point with that particular audience, I'm also considering the people who are listening. Are they all organists? Are they churchgoers, some of whom may love music, some may know nothing about music? What is my audience? And then knowing that the organ is the instrument, it's the tool through which I can express. I then consider this organ is not exactly like Bach's organ. This one has certain capabilities. It has certain sounds and colors that Bach's did not. It has certain capabilities that Bach's did not. It's not to say that that one is inherently better or worse. It's just different. And so that gives me a different set of tools that I could use expressively and interpretively to connect with the audience or the congregation.
That's wonderful. You're certainly a technical wizard, but I would say you are a genius at connecting with audiences. And we want you to know that we here at Preston Hollow Presbyterian Church know that, appreciate that, and love you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bradley, thank you so much for playing for us today. We thoroughly enjoyed this time together.
You're most welcome, Steve. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and we hope you'll join us for our next episode.